It was the autumn of 2014, and Elon Musk stood quietly at the edge of a balcony in Palo Alto, his Tesla Roadster parked below like a patient stallion. The world knew him as a genius entrepreneur, the visionary behind Tesla and SpaceX. But few knew how close he had come, just months before, to losing it all. The sun dipped low behind the California hills, casting a golden hue over the rooftops. Elon held a small envelope in his hand, yellowed at the edges, creased where it had been folded too many times. It contained the last remnant of a secret financial deal that had nearly destroyed everything he had worked for. Most people believed his greatest challenges were rockets that exploded or cars that wouldn't start. But those were visible, understandable. The true danger had come silently, wrapped in legal jargon and false promises, from a man he once called a friend. Back in early 2013, Elon had been juggling 3 empires: Tesla, SpaceX, and Solar City. His days blurred into nights, a whirlwind of innovation, pressure, and deadlines. It was during this time, when stress carved deep lines into his face and sleep became a rare luxury, that he received a visit from an old college acquaintance, Julian Shore. Julian wasn't famous. He wasn't flashy. He wore soft cashmere coats and always smelled faintly of lavender and ink. He had gone into finance, not engineering, and had built a reputation for creating discreet, high-yield investment instruments for ultra-wealthy clients. "I have something you'll want to see," Julian had said, sipping tea at Elon's private meeting room in the SpaceX headquarters. "It's quiet, safe, and it could stabilize your personal finances, give you breathing room." Elon had smiled. "I don't need safe. I need bold." Julian nodded slowly. "And I promise you, it's bold too. But it's backed by sovereign guarantees, the kind of thing no one hears about until years later." What followed was a proposal that seemed, at the time, like a lifeline. Julian offered Elon entry into a private capital pool, funded by foreign investors, structured offshore, and shielded from U.S. tax exposure. The fund would lend against future SpaceX contracts, offering Elon upfront liquidity to offset the personal guarantees he had made to keep Tesla afloat. There was risk, of course, but it was wrapped in complicated protections, and in Elon's fatigued, overburdened state, he saw it not as risk, but as opportunity. He signed. The money came fast. $250 million wired in 3 separate tranches. Elon used it to shore up Tesla's manufacturing, expand a critical battery facility, and personally repay a debt that had kept him up for weeks. For a time, it seemed like the right call. But 6 months later, the first crack appeared. Julian disappeared. His phone went unanswered. His New York office was suddenly shuttered. Lawyers began calling, quietly at first, then insistently. Elon's personal legal team, alarmed by a subtle clause in the original agreement, dug deeper. What they uncovered chilled them to the bone. The fund was not what it seemed. Instead of being backed by sovereign wealth, it had been tied to a speculative portfolio of Russian energy derivatives, assets whose value plummeted as geopolitical tensions rose in Ukraine. Worse, a side clause, buried 47 pages into the agreement, gave creditors the right to claim Elon's personal Tesla shares if the fund's value dropped below a certain threshold. And it had. By the time Elon was briefed, the threshold had already been crossed. Lawyers acting on behalf of an anonymous shell company had begun the process of seizing collateral. His collateral. He stood to lose 8% of his Tesla holdings overnight. The news hit him like a meteor. He had risked everything to build that company, slept on factory floors, missed birthdays, endured public ridicule, and now, through a single signature made during a moment of exhaustion, he might lose control of it all. Elon didn't panic, not outwardly, but inside, a quiet storm raged. He stopped sleeping altogether. He began working with his legal and financial teams around the clock, searching for a way to unwind the deal, to trace the money, to stop the bleeding. The press never caught wind of it. To the world, Elon was just the same enigmatic innovator, tweeting and building rockets. But behind the scenes, every hour mattered. He reached out to people he had once pushed away, quiet financiers in Switzerland, a retired SEC investigator he had once debated on live TV, even a former CIA consultant who specialized in tracking financial fraud. Together they began to unravel the web Julian had spun. Piece by piece they traced the flow of money, through Liechtenstein trusts, Panamanian holding companies, and shell firms registered in places Elon had never heard of. Each layer peeled away a deeper betrayal. But it wasn't until they reached the 11th holding company, a bland entity registered in Mauritius, that they found something remarkable. A signature. It wasn't Julian's. It was someone else's. A name that, when Elon saw it, made his hands tremble. It was a name from his past. A man who had once pitched to invest in Tesla and had been turned down flat by Elon himself. A man who had vanished after that rejection, and it seemed, had waited years for revenge. And he had chosen the perfect instrument, Julian Shore. And so began the darkest chapter in Elon's financial life. Not a battle of engineers, but of silence, paper, and shadows. A game not fought with innovation, but with old grudges and whispered betrayals. The next move would determine whether Elon Musk would remain the architect of the future, or become just another name swallowed by his own ambition. The name on the Mauritius document was Gareth Lyon, a financier with an impeccable public reputation and a long memory. Elon remembered him clearly, not because they had spent much time together, but because of the tone in Gareth's voice the last time they met. It had been years ago, in a clean, quiet office in Menlo Park. Gareth had offered a generous investment in early Tesla, but his terms had been sharp, his manner condescending. Elon had turned him down after a single meeting. "We're building a future, not just a car," Elon had said. Gareth had smiled thinly and replied, "You'll remember this moment when you're desperate." Now, years later, that prophecy echoed with painful clarity. Elon held the printed document as though it were radioactive. His legal counsel sat across the table, silent, waiting for his reaction. "So this is revenge?" Elon finally asked, voice low. "Not just revenge," said Miranda Chen, his senior legal strategist. "It's calculated. Gareth's been building this trap for years. Julian was the decoy. The real architecture, the shell companies, the fund structure. It's Gareth's. And now that the funds failed, the clauses kick in." "Can we fight it?" Miranda hesitated. "Technically, yes. But legally, it's airtight. He used your own exhaustion against you. The language in those clauses is unbreakable." Elon didn't move for a long while. He stared out the glass walls of the office. Below, engineers worked on the Falcon Heavy prototype. Above, satellites buzzed in low orbit, feeding data to Starlink terminals across the globe. And yet all of it, everything he had built, could be compromised by a man with a pen and a grudge. He turned back. "We need another way." Miranda nodded. "I've already started assembling something. Quiet allies. People who don't want your companies to fall into Gareth's hands. But it's going to require something rare." "What?" "Trust." That night, Elon did something he rarely did. He reached out to his brother, Kimball. Kimball Musk, tall and thoughtful, had always been a grounding presence in Elon's life. Where Elon saw futures, Kimball saw people. Where Elon chased stars, Kimball grew food. The two hadn't always seen eye to eye, but they had never stopped caring. They met in a quiet cabin in the Colorado mountains, far from reporters and signal jammers. Elon explained everything, laying out the paper trail, the betrayal, the possible seizure of Tesla shares. Kimball listened in silence, nodding slowly. When Elon finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. "You're too tired to fight this alone," Kimball said gently. "He's counting on that. I don't have time for rest." "You don't need rest. You need a circle." That was the beginning of what they jokingly called the Lighthouse Circle. It started with Kimball, then expanded to include a handful of people Elon trusted absolutely. An old college roommate turned cybersecurity expert, a retired venture capitalist who had once saved Tesla from collapse, and a former Treasury official who owed Elon a quiet favor. Together, they built a plan, not to fight Gareth head-on, but to outmaneuver him. First, they tracked the remaining assets tied to the fund. Some were still parked in foreign banks. Others had been reinvested into speculative real estate. Elon used his private capital to quietly buy them out, one by one, through proxies. Each purchase cut off one of Gareth's financial arteries. Then came the legal flank. Miranda Chen worked with the retired SEC official to find technical faults in the fund's documentation. Buried deep in one of the transfer chains, they found a single transaction that violated European anti-laundering protocols. That single breach gave them a foothold to freeze one of Gareth's key holding companies. Next came the messaging. Elon, long accused of being too open on social media, became suddenly silent. In his place, Kimball and others quietly leaked word through trusted contacts that Elon was preparing for a major philanthropic move, one that would require transferring a significant portion of his Tesla shares into an irrevocable trust. It wasn't true, yet, but it created uncertainty in Gareth's strategy. If the shares were transferred, they could no longer be seized. Gareth, watching from afar, began to flinch. Then Elon made his boldest move yet. He flew to London, unannounced, to meet with an investor who had been circling Tesla for years but had never pulled the trigger. She was old money, discreet, and controlled a European pension fund with vast resources. Over tea in a quiet room lined with books, Elon laid out his story, not just of betrayal, but of vision. He showed her a prototype of the Tesla Model X, a rough sketch of the Mars habitat, a map of the developing Starlink network. "I've made mistakes," he said softly, "but I haven't stopped dreaming." She listened carefully, then smiled. "I don't invest in men," she said. "I invest in time, and you, Mr. Musk, may have less of it than you think. But I believe in what you're building." She agreed to back him, with a single condition. "You must end this with honor. Don't just destroy him, outgrow him." It took 3 more weeks to finalize the deal. Elon transferred the fund's toxic debt to her trust. In exchange, she received a long-term stake in a future Tesla spin-off, a clean energy platform he had been secretly developing. When Gareth received notice of the transfer, he knew the game was over. He tried one last move, filing for arbitration in an obscure jurisdiction. But by then, Elon had already shut the door. The Lighthouse Circle had sealed every breach. Gareth's empire began to crumble. One shell company collapsed. Another was absorbed by a competing firm. Julian Shore, found living under a false name in Cyprus, agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. The deal that nearly ruined Elon Musk was over, but its legacy would haunt him still. Elon Musk had survived, but the cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in trust, in sleepless nights, in relationships strained under the weight of secrets. He had outmaneuvered the trap, but he had also seen the shadows that success could cast, and they weren't finished with him yet. For weeks after the financial crisis had been contained, Elon Musk moved through life with a quieter, more deliberate energy. He no longer raced through decisions. He walked slower, listened more. He had faced many battles before, technical failures, market collapses, public ridicule. But this had been something deeper, something colder, a betrayal not of business, but of belief. Still, there was work to be done. The aftermath of Gareth Lyon's failed takeover had left scars on the balance sheets and deeper wounds on Elon's trust in others. But there was also a strange peace in knowing he had weathered the storm. Or so he thought. Late one night, he sat alone in a conference room overlooking Tesla's Fremont factory. The whir of distant machines filled the background like a steady heartbeat. On the table before him lay a thick file folder, delivered not by email, but by hand. It bore no name, only a single line on the cover. Zurich Inquiry, for review only. Elon flipped it open, his fingers brushing the pages as though they might burn. What he found chilled him once again. Gareth Lyon hadn't acted alone. The file detailed a confidential report compiled by a private investigator in Europe, hired discreetly by the investor who had helped Elon reclaim his shares. Within its pages were transcripts, bank records, and encrypted messages linking Gareth's offshore activity to a small but powerful group of shadow investors. Their motive, not just revenge, influence. These individuals had quietly targeted visionaries who controlled significant technological infrastructure. Not to take them down, but to control them. And Elon, with his grasp on energy, transportation, and satellite networks, was the crown jewel. It wasn't personal, it was structural. Elon sat back, heart pounding. The realization struck like a thunderclap. What had happened with Gareth was only a test. He remembered something Gareth had once said during that long-ago Tesla pitch. There are 3 kinds of power, Elon: money, machines, and momentum. You only think you have all 3. Perhaps he had been warning him even then. Elon stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the factory. Rows of Model S sedans gleamed under the moonlight. Men and women worked quietly, unaware of the invisible war that had been waged to keep the company theirs. He couldn't afford another surprise. The lesson had been brutal, but clear. From that moment, Elon began building something new, something he never spoke about in public. It started with a small team of engineers and cybersecurity experts, people handpicked from both Tesla and SpaceX. They called it Sentinel, an internal oversight project designed not to protect against outside hackers, but to monitor financial vulnerabilities. A living shield around his empire, watching for patterns, fluctuations, and silent breaches. Sentinel wasn't a product, it was a lifeline. It tracked not only Tesla's systems, but Elon's own holdings, cross-referencing shell structures, flagging abnormal transactions, and mapping any offshore movement tied to his name or reputation. It even tracked Gareth Lyon. Gareth had gone quiet after the failed seizure. Rumor had it he was living in seclusion in the French Alps, writing a book under a pseudonym. Elon doubted it. Men like Gareth didn't write. They watched, waited, planned. But Sentinel gave Elon peace. For the first time, he wasn't playing defense. He was watching back. Still, some wounds ran deeper. Elon's relationship with his inner circle had changed. Kimball, though still his brother and confidant, had grown more cautious around him, perhaps worried that the high stakes of Elon's life would eventually consume them all. Miranda Chen, loyal and brilliant, had requested a sabbatical to reconnect with real life. Elon had agreed, quietly heartbroken. The lighthouse circle remained, but it was dimmer now, more like a memory than a movement. One evening, as a quiet rain fell over Los Angeles, Elon received a letter, handwritten, no return address. It read, "You passed the test, Elon. You held your ground. But remember, those who reach for the stars often forget to look beneath their feet. Watch the ground. That's where shadows gather. G." He read it 3 times, then burned it in the fireplace. The message wasn't a threat, it was a truth. Despite the fire and fury, Gareth had respected Elon enough to acknowledge his resilience. In some twisted way, it was admiration, and maybe even a warning that the next wave wouldn't come from an enemy, but from his own blind spot. Elon went to bed that night with a sense of clarity. It was time to act not as a builder of companies, but as a guardian of vision. In the weeks that followed, Elon began a quiet transformation of his leadership. He restructured Tesla's board, installing allies who understood not only business, but the subtle art of safeguarding legacy. He reinforced SpaceX's private structures, insulating its most sensitive innovations from external influence. And he expanded Starlink's encrypted layer, ensuring that no one could access its data flow without a trace. But the most radical change was personal. He created a codicil to his estate, one that would, upon his passing or incapacitation, release a complete archive of everything he had learned from the Gareth Lyon affair. A founder's letter, encrypted and distributed to trusted nodes across the globe. Its title was simple: "To those who build, beware the quiet deal." It was his final insurance policy, not against death, but against forgetting, because that was the true danger, not the betrayal, not the debt, but the silence that followed, the temptation to move on without learning, and Elon would not forget. The storm had passed, but the sky above him would never be the same. He had glimpsed a hidden world, where deals were struck in the dark, and power was measured in shadows. And though he had survived it, Elon Musk now understood the cost of being a visionary in a world that often prefers control over courage. But the greatest revelation was still to come, hidden not in a contract or clause, but in a person. Someone from his past watching quietly, waiting patiently. Someone who knew both Gareth and Elon. It began with a name Elon hadn't heard in almost 20 years. The message came through a secure channel late one night, encrypted, marked confidential, and oddly short. It was forwarded by Sentinel, flagged not for danger, but for familiarity. The sender's identity had been partially masked, but the system pulled out one crucial phrase from the metadata. Leona Hallberg. Elon stared at the screen. Leona. Years ago, in the days before PayPal, before Silicon Valley headlines and Mars colonization dreams, Leona Hallberg had been a colleague. More than that, a fellow idealist. She had been one of the first people he'd ever brainstormed with, back when ambition was measured not in billions, but in hours spent at whiteboards. They'd met during a tech conference in Vancouver in the late 90s. She was brilliant, specializing in cryptography and economic modeling, always with a cup of coffee in one hand and a dozen new ideas in the other. Elon had been in awe of her. For a while they had worked closely, even talked about founding something together. But their paths diverged. She took a position with a global consultancy, then disappeared into what Elon later suspected was some kind of intelligence work. Their last conversation had ended with her saying, "You'll build something they can't touch. Just be sure you don't become one of them." And now, 2 decades later, she had resurfaced. The message itself was short. Only one line: "What Gareth failed to do, others will try again. Some are closer than you think." Attached was a document, heavily redacted, with surveillance timestamps and partial financial flows. It wasn't about Gareth Lyon. It was about someone inside Elon's own organizations. A mole. Elon called an emergency meeting the next morning. Only 4 people were invited. Kimball, Miranda, back from her sabbatical, the head of Sentinel, and a quiet woman named Rena D'Souza, Tesla's internal ethics officer. Rena had been brought on 2 years earlier, after a close-call whistleblower scare, and she had proven to be methodical and incorruptible. Together, they examined Leona's file. The evidence was troubling. At least one senior-level executive at SpaceX had been quietly feeding financial performance data to a third-party consultancy with ties to offshore investment funds. The documents didn't name the individual directly, but they showed IP traces, access patterns, and unusual late-night file transfers. Elon felt a tightening in his chest. He had spent years building a wall of loyalty around his teams, protecting innovation not just from competitors, but from compromise. And yet, someone had found a way through. He tasked Sentinel with a full silent audit. Every login, every transaction. No one was told. Within days, they had a name. Nikolai Varnov, a brilliant systems engineer who had worked at SpaceX for 7 years. Nikolai had earned Elon's trust through relentless precision and almost obsessive dedication to launch safety. He had been promoted twice, never took vacations, always the last to leave. And yet, the audit was clear. Over the past 11 months, Nikolai had been leaking minor data packets, never enough to trip alarms, but consistent, like a drip. Some contained nothing more than performance metrics. Others were more sensitive. Propulsion tests, contract margins, internal memos. He had covered his tracks well, but not perfectly. Rena's team approached him quietly, under the guise of a routine performance review. Elon watched the interview from a private room, his heart heavy. Nikolai didn't deny it. He spoke calmly, like a man who had already rehearsed every word. "I did it because someone asked," he said, "and they paid well. But that's not the reason I kept going." "Then why?" Rena asked gently. "Because they weren't just asking for data. They were asking what you're building, what it means, the kind of power you're collecting." He looked directly into the camera, as if he knew Elon was watching. Most people see the rockets, the cars, the satellites. But someone out there sees something else. They see consolidation, energy, transportation, communication, in one man's hands. Elon said nothing. He felt a strange mixture of anger, betrayal, and, deep down, understanding. Nikolai continued. "They don't want to destroy you. They want to understand how to contain you." He was let go quietly, with legal boundaries set and security reviews intensified. Sentinel reinforced its parameters. But the damage had already been done, not just to the infrastructure but to Elon's faith. That evening, Elon sat on the rooftop of his Los Angeles home, staring up at the stars. He remembered what Leona had once said. "Be sure you don't become one of them." It haunted him now, not because he believed he had become dangerous, but because he finally saw the full shape of the game he was in. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a nexus. To governments, he was influence. To investors, he was volatility. To visionaries, he was hope. And to those who moved in shadows, he was a threat that needed managing. He reached out to Leona. "After 2 days," she replied. They met in person, unofficially, far from media or eyes. She was older now, sharp as ever, with that same knowing calm. "I warned you," she said over tea. "I didn't listen," Elon replied. She slid a folder across the table. You've survived 2 attempts. There will be more, but I can help you stay ahead. Not by fighting, by understanding the ecosystem you've stepped into. She offered to work with Sentinel, not as a formal employee, but as a consultant, a whisperer of sorts, someone who could see the shape of threats before they emerged. Elon agreed, not because he feared the next attack, but because he now knew it would come from within, from people who understood his dreams, and who would use them to mold him into something quieter, safer, and more controllable. He wouldn't let that happen. The war for his legacy wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The enemy now wore familiar faces. The threat came not from bombs or boards, but from hands held out in friendship. And as Elon Musk walked back into his office, he understood something he never had before. The real challenge of building the future is guarding it. But the final truth, about who had orchestrated it all, was still waiting. And it would force Elon to make the most painful decision of his life. The final revelation came not with a shout, but a whisper. A single phone call, untraceable, 6 seconds of silence, then a voice, faint, accented, measured. You've come far, Elon, but you still don't see who's behind the curtain. Click. Elon stood motionless in the center of the Tesla design lab. The call had come in through an old, secure line, one only 3 people were supposed to know about. It hadn't rung in over a decade, and now it had awakened something buried deep in his memory. There had been someone else. Long before Tesla, long before SpaceX, a mentor, not by title, but by influence. His name was Edward Bryce, a retired South African industrialist who had taken an early interest in Elon during his university years. Bryce had been quiet, unassuming, and immensely wealthy. He'd often spoken about the unseen gears of power, how true influence operated in silence. Elon had visited his estate only twice, both times feeling as if he were walking into a vault where history was rewritten before it ever happened. When Elon left South Africa, he lost contact with Bryce. The man had vanished from the public eye. There were rumors of offshore dealings, quiet interventions in global politics, a hand in guiding the fate of nations without ever stepping into the light. Now, the voice on the phone, it hadn't been Gareth, or Nikolai, or Leona. It had been Bryce. The final curtain lifted. Elon called Leona immediately. I know who started it. She didn't ask how. She simply said, then you also know why. For days, Elon disappeared from public view. He didn't go to the factories, didn't log into systems, didn't even speak to Kimball. Instead, he returned to where it all began, his childhood home in Pretoria. The house had long since been sold, but he stood across the street staring at the window where he once gazed up at the stars and dreamed of rockets. Bryce had always believed that power must be channeled, controlled, that when visionaries gained too much momentum, they needed guardrails. He had invested in Elon not because he believed in his dreams, but because he saw a future he could shape through Elon. But when Elon diverged, choosing open skies instead of corridors of control, Bryce had stepped away. Or so Elon had thought. The Gareth Lyon incident, the financial trap, the mole at SpaceX. They weren't isolated events. They were tests, calibrations. And Bryce had been behind them all, not to destroy Elon, but to bring him back under control, to remind him who had helped light the first spark. Elon flew to Zurich, where he had traced Bryce's most recent activity. It was late autumn. The leaves were dying gold. He found the old man in a private garden, sitting alone, feeding pigeons. Edward Bryce was thinner now, his face etched by time, but his eyes, still sharp, still watchful, met Elon's without surprise. You found me, he said, as if they had merely lost touch for a few months. Why? Elon asked. Bryce didn't answer right away. He tossed another handful of seeds to the pigeons. You are a force of nature, Elon. But nature unchecked brings ruin. I didn't want to stop you. I wanted to guide you, shape your ascent. You nearly destroyed everything I built. I strengthened it. What survived was meant to survive. Elon felt his hands clench. You used people, hurt them. So have you. The words hit like a cold slap. Elon sat down on the opposite bench, watching Bryce carefully. So this was about control, about me being your proxy. It was about the world, Bryce replied. About making sure it doesn't fall into chaos because one man dreams too loudly. There it was. the quiet arrogance of the invisible elite, the belief that vision required a leash. Elon stood slowly. You taught me to think in systems, but you forgot something. What's that? Systems change. Especially when you give people a reason to believe in something better. Bryce smiled faintly, almost sadly. Then we'll see, won't we? They never spoke again. Elon returned to California different, quieter, sharper, not cynical, but resolved. He expanded Sentinel into a global initiative, bringing in experts from around the world to monitor not just threats to his companies, but threats to innovation itself, an early warning system for sabotage, coercion, and quiet corruption. He opened up the Lighthouse Circle to other founders, people building the future with their own hands, unprotected by the old guard. It became more than a network. It became a shield, and he rewrote his final codicil. It was no longer just a warning. It was a map, a guide for those who would come after him, so they could build without fear, without compromise, without the quiet hand of men like Bryce trying to turn their dreams into puppets. He called it the Dreamer's Testament. Elon knew he wouldn't live forever, but what he had endured, the betrayals, the tests, the revelations, had given him something rare, clarity, and with that clarity came peace. One evening, as the stars blinked quietly overhead, Elon stood outside a small SpaceX facility, watching the silhouette of a new rocket on the launch pad. A young engineer beside him said, "Hard to believe you built all this." Elon smiled faintly. "I didn't. I just kept it from falling apart." He looked up at the stars, still dreaming, but now, finally, awake. The secret financial deal had nearly ruined him, but in the end, it revealed something far more powerful, the shape of the forces that move beneath the surface of the world. And though Elon Musk would always carry the scars, he had done something few ever do. He faced the shadow and walked through it.